Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character?
Our Super Bowl right now isn't the NFL, it's not politics, it's not even awards season. Our Super Bowl is Justin Baldoni versus Blake Lively. And if you've been following this case even casually, you know exactly why this week matters so much. This is the moment where speculation starts turning into evidence, where narratives start colliding with expert reports, and where one side's entire argument either holds up under scrutiny or starts to crack. And now, for the first time, we're officially kicking off expert disclosures. Baldoni's side has put their first expert on the table, and that expert is saying something Blake Lively absolutely does not want to hear. There is no smear campaign. Now let's be honest up front, because everyone likes to say it. Yes, lawyers hire experts who support their theory of the case. That's how litigation works. Nobody is pretending otherwise. But here's the problem for Blake Lively's side. This isn't some random consultant they found on LinkedIn or a guy who popped up overnight to say what they wanted him to say. This is a serious crisis communications expert with decades of experience, legal credentials, real-world case studies, and a reputation that would actually hold up on a witness stand in a New York courtroom. And his conclusion doesn't just defend Baldoni. It actively undercuts the entire idea that what happened to Blake Lively online was manufactured, orchestrated, or weaponized by some secret digital army. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what the expert actually says, what his assignment was, why his credentials matter, how he explains crisis communications in plain English, and most importantly, why his analysis makes Blake Lively's claim of a smear campaign look less like a coordinated attack and more like something much simpler and much harsher. People just didn't like her. And yes, that's a brutal thing to hear, especially when you're a major celebrity who's used to controlling the narrative. Now, will this change the minds of diehard Blake Lively supporters? Probably not. Let's be real. People don't usually change their minds once they've emotionally picked a side. But here's the real question that matters. Will a jury believe this expert? And if they do, does that move this case closer to a settlement? Because right now, the judge has already nudged both sides toward trying to resolve this before trial. We're going to find out very soon whether that's possible or whether this thing is headed straight into a courtroom showdown at the end of May. And yes, if it goes to trial, I'll be there in New York City covering it. I'm already here this week, freezing my face off in Christmas season weather, but this case is worth it. So let's stop wasting time and get into the actual substance. I have the full expert report in front of me. This is the report of James Haggerty, the president and CEO of PRCG Haggerty LLC. And I'm not going to read this thing word for word because there's repetition, legal padding, and plenty of formalities. Instead, I'm going to walk you through what actually matters, what a jury would hear, and why this report is such a problem for Blake Lively's smear campaign narrative. First, let's talk about who James Haggerty actually is, because credibility is everything when it comes to expert witnesses. Courts don't care how loud you are on social media. They care whether you know what you're talking about and whether you've been doing this long enough to recognize real manipulation versus organic backlash. Haggerty isn't just a PR guy. He's the president and CEO of a New York-based public relations firm with an international reputation, specifically in crisis communications and litigation-related communications. That distinction matters. This isn't general PR where you're pitching feel-good stories or managing red carpet appearances. This is the kind of PR that deals with lawsuits, reputational threats, public controversies, and media storms that can cost people millions of dollars. On top of that, he's also an attorney, admitted to practice law in New York and Florida. That means he understands not just public messaging, but how that messaging interacts with legal exposure, discovery, testimony, and courtroom strategy. He's written multiple books on communication topics, served as a columnist for legal publications like American Lawyer and Corporate Counsel magazine, and written extensively on the intersection of media, law, and reputation. In other words, this isn't a lightweight. This is exactly the kind of expert you'd expect to see in a high-stakes celebrity lawsuit. Now let's talk about his assignment, because this is where people like to misrepresent things. Haggerty wasn't hired to say Justin Baldoni is innocent or Blake Lively is lying. That's not what crisis communication experts do. His assignment was to analyze whether the actions taken by Baldoni's side fit within standard, ethical, accepted practices in crisis communications, and whether those actions could realistically have caused the sudden surge of negative sentiment Blake Lively experienced online. He explains that he was retained by Baldoni's legal team to prepare a report on crisis communications planning, scenario planning, and standard PR practices when facing potential reputational harm. He reviewed documents prepared by TAG, the crisis communications firm involved, including a scenario planning document related to It Ends With Us, as well as publicly available information. And this is where the misunderstanding begins, because Blake Lively's entire argument hinges on the idea that hiring crisis communications means you must have done something wrong. Her side wants the jury to believe that if you bring in crisis PR, you're basically admitting guilt. Haggerty shuts that idea down immediately. He explains that crisis communications management in the face of reputational risk has long been an accepted, ethical, and standard practice. In today's media environment, failing to prepare for reputational threats can actually make things worse. Lack of preparation accelerates crises. It doesn't prevent them. Here's a simple way to understand it. If your house is on fire, calling the fire department doesn't mean you started the fire. It means you're trying to stop it from burning the entire neighborhood down. Crisis PR works the same way. You don't wait until the internet has already decided you're guilty to start planning. You plan because the stakes are high, the narrative moves fast, and the damage can be irreversible. Blake Lively's side wants to flip that logic and say, why would you need crisis PR unless you caused the crisis? That's emotionally persuasive, but it's professionally wrong. And Haggerty explains that in detail. He also addresses the misinformation surrounding crisis communications professionals themselves. According to him, popular media has turned crisis PR into this shadowy, villainous profession where people manipulate the internet behind the scenes. In reality, most crisis communications work is reactive, defensive, and focused on mitigating damage rather than creating it. One of the most important points he makes early in the report is about timing. Changing public opinion at scale takes time. Weeks, sometimes months. Even with aggressive digital marketing, meaningful sentiment shifts don't happen overnight. That's critical, because Blake Lively's complaint alleges that Baldoni's team hired consultants and then almost immediately unleashed a wave of negative sentiment against her. And Haggerty says that simply doesn't line up with how digital influence actually works. Tools for media and social media monitoring are imperfect, especially during litigation. Correlation doesn't equal causation. And if you don't drill down into the data, you can't draw reliable conclusions. This is where his professional background really shows. He explains that there are different types of PR, and they're not interchangeable. Promotional PR for a movie release is completely different from defensive crisis PR. The PR you use to sell tickets is not the PR you use when your director is suddenly being unfollowed by cast members and rumors are spreading online. And this matters because Baldoni's side was clearly on the defensive. The cast unfollowing him, his absence from promotional events, and the sudden narrative shift created a reputational emergency. When millions of dollars are on the line, you don't just sit back and hope it blows over. Haggerty explains that scenario planning is about preparing for possible outcomes. What if Blake Lively makes a public statement? What if Taylor Swift's fanbase gets involved? What if the narrative spirals? Planning for those possibilities isn't evidence of malice. It's evidence of prudence. And yes, Taylor Swift matters here. Whether people like it or not, her audience is massive. Any suggestion that her fanbase could turn on Baldoni was a legitimate concern. That doesn't mean anyone planned to weaponize her fans. It means they were aware of the risk. Haggerty then moves into a broader explanation of crisis communications as a field. Reputation, he explains, is an essential part of brand value. It shapes stakeholder perception and directly influences financial outcomes. Crisis planning exists to manage unexpected events that threaten that reputation. He quotes academic definitions of crisis, including one from Harvard Business School Press, defining a crisis as any change that results in an urgent problem capable of causing serious harm to reputation or bottom line. That definition fits this situation perfectly. From there, the report gets into the heart of the smear campaign allegation. Blake Lively's second amended complaint claims that Baldoni's team hired consultants who then orchestrated a coordinated digital attack, seeding negative content across social media and online forums, beginning around August 8, 2024. Here's where timing becomes everything. According to the complaint itself, one consultant wasn't even retained until August 2nd, and another not until August 8th, the same day Blake Lively claims negative sentiment spiked. Haggerty says that based on his experience, it's highly unlikely, bordering on impossible, that a sophisticated digital marketing or smear operation could be designed, deployed, and executed in that time frame. Digital campaigns don't work like flipping a switch. Search engine optimization takes months. Content marketing takes months. Even coordinated social media strategies take planning, infrastructure, and time to gain traction. The idea that a full-scale smear campaign materialized overnight simply doesn't align with reality. He cites industry estimates showing that SEO efforts often take 3 to 6 months just to start producing results, sometimes a year or more in competitive spaces. Content marketing, especially when relying on third-party platforms, takes sustained effort. Yes, there are different forms of digital marketing, including automated tools and AI-driven engagement, but even those require setup, testing, and calibration. In high-profile legal disputes, these efforts don't magically produce immediate mass sentiment shifts. Haggerty also takes aim at the charts Blake Lively's side uses to prove their case. These charts allegedly show a surge in negative sentiment beginning August 8th. But he points out a major flaw. The complaint provides no methodology. No explanation of how sentiment was measured, what tools were used, or how positive versus negative mentions were classified. This is a huge problem. Sentiment analysis is inherently subjective. Algorithms struggle with nuance, sarcasm, context, and dispute-related coverage. If an article simply mentions that Blake Lively is involved in a controversy, many systems automatically classify that as negative, even if the tone is neutral or balanced. In other words, once the dispute itself became news, almost any mention of Blake Lively could be logged as negative, regardless of whether it criticized her or not. That inflates negative sentiment artificially. Haggerty explains that in similar cases he's worked on, automated monitoring tools often mislabel content. When his team manually reviewed individual posts, they found that many articles were neutral in tone, but the monitoring software still flagged them as negative because the dispute was mentioned at all. This is a key point. The existence of negative sentiment doesn't prove manipulation. Proves attention. And attention during a public dispute is rarely neutral. He emphasizes that without a deeper dive into the underlying data, not just charts, but actual content, it's impossible to determine whether sentiment shifts were organic or engineered. And based on his review, the data presented in Blake Lively's complaint simply doesn't support the conclusion she's asking the court to draw. At this point, the expert's position is clear. Crisis communications are standard. Timing doesn't support a smear campaign. Data analysis is flawed. And the idea that Baldoni's team somehow flipped public opinion overnight doesn't make sense. Now let's get into the part of this expert report that really matters, because everything we've talked about so far builds toward one simple question. What is James Haggerty actually prepared to say to a jury under oath? Not on YouTube, not on Twitter, not in some PR spin room, but in a courtroom, in front of 12 people who have to decide whether Justin Baldoni and his team engaged in a coordinated smear campaign against Blake Lively. This is where the tone of the report shifts from explanation to conclusion. And it's also where Blake Lively's legal theory runs into serious trouble. Haggerty makes it very clear that based on his professional background, his experience in crisis communications, and his review of the relevant literature and materials in this case, the hiring of a crisis communications consultant should not be considered evidence of negative or nefarious intent. He doesn't hedge this. He doesn't soften it. He says it directly. In his view, retaining crisis PR in the face of reputational threat is acceptable, appropriate, and prudent. This applies whether you're a corporation, a brand, or a high-profile individual. He goes further and explains that misunderstanding the role of crisis communications professionals is what often leads to the kind of accusations Blake Lively is making. Media monitoring, scenario planning, and reputational risk assessment are standard tools in public relations. They are not, by default, tools of manipulation. They are defensive measures meant to help people understand what is being said about them and respond appropriately. This distinction matters a lot in front of a jury, because juries don't just look at what happened. They look at why it happened. They ask whether something makes sense. And when you explain crisis PR in plain terms, it stops sounding sinister and starts sounding like common sense. Haggerty also directly addresses the allegation that Baldoni's team somehow caused the growth in negative media and social media coverage of Blake Lively starting in August 2024. His conclusion is that this is unlikely given the short time frame involved. In other words, the timeline simply doesn't work. This isn't speculation. This is someone who has spent decades watching how narratives actually move online. And he's telling the court that the tools used to measure sentiment during litigation are often unreliable, especially when disputes are complex and emotionally charged. That's why, he says, it's necessary to drill down into the data before claiming a causal relationship. Now think about how this plays in a courtroom. Blake Lively's attorneys can cross-examine him. They can try to poke holes in his conclusions. They can suggest bias. But they can't easily erase his experience. And they can't magically fix the timeline problem. Then there's the common sense argument, the one that doesn't even require expert testimony, but becomes even stronger when backed by it. Why would Justin Baldoni want to sink his own movie? This is the part that, to me, makes the smear campaign claim almost absurd when you step back and look at it logically. It ends with Us wasn't some throwaway project for Baldoni. This was his passion project. He spent years developing it. He directed it. He starred in it. He had a billionaire backer. His reputation, his future as a filmmaker, and a massive amount of money were all tied up in this film succeeding. Blake Lively wasn't just a random co-star. She was the face of the movie. She was the marketing engine. She brought star power, visibility, and yes, Taylor Swift's orbit into the project. Taylor Swift has a song in the movie. Taylor Swift has one of the most powerful fan bases on the planet. At any point, if Blake Lively truly felt attacked, she could have created real problems for this production. So ask yourself, at what point does it make sense for Baldoni to activate a smear campaign against the star of his own movie while the movie is still being promoted? That wouldn't just be unethical. It would be self-destructive. It would be one of the worst business decisions imaginable. If this alleged smear campaign had started years after the movie came out, you might at least be able to argue motive. But during the promotional window, while ticket sales, press coverage, and audience perception are everything, it makes no sense. And when you look at the actual communications that have come out in this case, what you see isn't a mastermind plotting to destroy Blake Lively. What you see is a production bending over backwards to keep her happy. Wardrobe fittings moved to her penthouse. Schedule accommodations.
Délai d'intimacy, coordination, discussion.
Private travel arrangements. Script input. Even allowing her husband to contribute creatively. Again and again, the record shows efforts to accommodate, appease, and de-escalate. They tried everything short of giving up creative control of the film. And that's where the real conflict seems to have been. Baldoni and his team wanted to make the movie they set out to make. They didn't want to hand the keys over entirely. And when that tension reached a breaking point, the fallout became public. What happened next didn't require a smear campaign. The internet did what the internet always does. Blake Lively already had a complicated public image. She's admired by many, but she's also been criticized for years for coming across as aloof, entitled, or dismissive. When clips resurfaced of her being rude to interviewers, when people felt she wasn't taking the subject matter of the film seriously, when she appeared to be promoting her liquor brand while talking about a sensitive story, the backlash didn't need to be engineered. Caught fire on its own. That's how viral culture works. One clip turns into 10. 10 turn into think pieces. Think pieces turn into trends. And once the narrative starts rolling, sentiment shifts fast. This is exactly what Haggerty is describing when he says the negativity toward Blake Lively was likely organic. Not fake. Not planted. Not seeded by some secret army. Just people reacting, amplifying, and piling on. And here's the harsh reality that celebrities don't like to accept. Sometimes public backlash isn't about fairness. It's about vibes. It's about timing. It's about whether people feel you're being authentic. And once they decide you're not, the tone shifts quickly. Haggerty even explains that sentiment analysis tools often fail in moments like this because they can't tell the difference between criticism and commentary. Once a dispute becomes newsworthy, everything gets flagged as negative. That doesn't mean someone caused it. It means the spotlight is on. So when Blake Lively's complaint shows charts full of red bars and negative numbers, Haggerty is essentially saying, okay, but what does this actually prove? Without methodology, without context, without a manual review of the underlying content, those charts don't tell the story her lawyers want them to tell. And that's where this expert report becomes dangerous for her case, because it reframes the entire narrative. Instead of asking, did Baldoni orchestrate a smear campaign? The jury may end up asking, is Blake Lively blaming others for an organic backlash she didn't expect? That's a very different question. And it's not one that plays well when you're accusing someone of malicious intent. Now let's talk about where this leaves the case overall. The judge has already asked both sides to explore settlement. That doesn't mean settlement will happen. In fact, given how entrenched the narratives are, I wouldn't hold my breath. But this expert report strengthens Baldoni's negotiating position. It gives his side something tangible to point to and say, we're not just denying this. We have professional analysis backing us up. And if this goes to trial, Haggerty is the kind of witness juries tend to trust. He's calm. He's credentialed. He's not flashy. He explains things in a way that makes sense. And most importantly, his conclusions align with basic logic. At the end of the day, this case may not turn on whether Blake Lively faced negativity online. She clearly did. The question is why. And based on this report, the answer doesn't appear to be a smear campaign. It appears to be the internet doing what it does best. Judging, reacting, and moving on to the next controversy. That doesn't make it fair. It doesn't make it kind. But it also doesn't make it illegal. And that's the line Baldoni's team is drawing. So where do we go from here? We're going to see Blake Lively's side respond. They'll bring their own experts. They'll challenge methodology. They'll argue motive. They'll try to paint crisis communications as something darker than it really is. That's their job. But for now, this is a significant development. It's not a final verdict. It's not a knockout punch. But it's a strong step forward for Baldoni's defense and a serious obstacle for the smear campaign narrative. This really is our Super Bowl. And the next few weeks are going to be wild. If you found this breakdown helpful, you know what to do. Hit the like button. Subscribe. Leave a comment. It tells the algorithm this content matters and makes it easier for me to keep covering this case in depth. I'll be back tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. Twice a day, every day, for your rush hour commute. We'll see where this goes next.